Hey, Julie, we are so happy to have you on the Sisterhood podcast today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be part of the sisterhood now. Thanks for the invitation.
You definitely are. So, you're in the Midwest, correct?
Yes, that's where I live now.
And who do you live with?
I live with my husband, Mike. We've been married for 26 years, and we have three sons. Our 17-year-old lives with us all the time, and then our 21 and 23-year-old come and go, as you know, that stage of life with jobs and school. So we had them all home during quote COVID quarantine, so that was quite a gift.
Oh, so
Yeah,
great.
yeah,
Well, Julie, I just find you to be fascinating because you really are an expert in a field that is not so easy to stand in and to be really a voice in. And yet you have felt called there, you have chosen it. Can you tell us a little bit about how God called you to this area of sexuality and really what prompted you to say yes?
yeah. I'm definitely a reluctant expert in this. People have called me a sexpert or the sex lady, and I'm like, I hate those titles. But God called me specifically to address issues of sexuality probably about 10 years ago. And before that, I'm trained as a clinical psychologist. So had talked about sexuality, taught on it, written a book on it, just as part of the work that I did as a psychologist working with marriage and family. But about 10 years ago, God very dramatically called me to only focus on intimacy and sexuality. And it really came through a deep time of just intimacy with God, of just seeking Him, just kind of out of the blue. Some of you might relate to that, having gone through seasons where it's like God just gets your attention through pain or through His work in your life. And then I was working for a large Christian ministry that was talking about marriage and family issues, but I felt like they were skimming the surface on these issues of sexuality. And all around me, it was like the Lord was bringing people that were suffering because of sexual pain, whether it was pain in marriage or loneliness, abandonment, betrayal, sexual addiction, all kinds of struggles, sexual abuse recovery, trafficking. And it was almost like it was screaming at me, no one is talking about these things. We're just
Mm.
doing flybys instead of getting in the trenches with the brokenness that women are walking around with. And so in 2012, I founded the ministry Authentic Intimacy with a mentor of mine, and we've been at it ever since. So it is a difficult topic, and my heart often breaks. And I often feel like I lack the courage to speak into some of these topics that I know are controversial and represent a lot of pain for people. But then I get to
Hmm.
see what happens when we're just honest.
Hmm. Yeah, and we are talking today about how we have these conversations. So it's interesting that you felt like on a macro level, we haven't really been talking about this as the church. And I don't know if you would say culturally in general that we're not digging deep, that we stick maybe to these surface, I'm on this side, I'm on this side, or I think this, but we don't go a layer deeper into the pain behind it. Um,
Yes.
but then how do we do that on the micro level too? Because our listeners, I would suspect, are really mostly concerned with how do I have these conversations with people in my family that I love and care about? So I find it interesting that we're really not having the big conversations culturally, but we're also struggling in our personal conversations. And that makes sense that
Yeah.
if we're struggling in one area as a people, we would be struggling in another.
Yeah, you're right, Alex. I think the big conversations model for us how we deal with individual conversations and our own pain. And so, if you're part of a faith community that never talks about sex, or the only time they talk about it, it seems like it's nuanced in shame and judgment, then you learn, well, I can't talk about this with my friends either, or I can't address it with even people that love me because I'll be shamed or I'll be judged. And I think the culture is talking about it a lot, but they're talking about it more in terms of social justice issues, just kind of like we've got to fight for victims, and which is a good start, but they're not adequately talking about, I think, the nuance of what all this represents in people's lives. And when we talk about Me Too, for example, it's not just a hashtag. Every person you meet that has suffered sexual trauma, male or female, has a unique story and carries pieces of that pain. You know, everybody you meet who is identifying as LGBTQ, they have an individual story, and so we slap these labels on issues without recognizing that there's so much depth in a person's journey and story and struggle. So I think what the culture isn't doing well, what the church isn't doing well, has impacted us in our ability to talk about this at an individual level.
I really want to do a little bit of a pullback right now on just sexuality. And I want to quote something you said in a blog post. You said, "Your sexuality is either drawing you closer to God or it is a barrier to true intimacy and fellowship with Him. For most people, the latter is true. Their shame, their hidden wounds, their vows to never trust again, and their secret sins keep God at arm's length. They may be getting along just fine on the surface, but they don't know Jesus Christ intimately."
Mhm.
And what's interesting about this quote is, I've heard from lots of people, from pastors or teachers that have been teaching on sexual sin, that it's not a worse sin, but it's a different sin. It
Yeah.
impacts people and their souls, their bodies differently than other types of sin. And and you kind of is that what you're alluding to in this quote? And what do you mean by it keeps God at arm's length?
Yeah, I think sin is just one aspect of it. It's most importantly not just a different kind of sin, it's a different kind of gift to humanity. Our sexuality is a different aspect of who we are. And what I'm getting at is that the way we were created to be sexual, and I don't just mean in having sex, but our drives, our desires, our longings, we're meant to be spiritual, not just horizontal in relationship. What I mean by that is if you read the Bible, for example, sexuality, marriage, sexual fidelity are used over and over and over again as metaphors to teach us about the kind of relationship that God wants to have with his people. And so God created us as sexual people to give us a physical way that we can experience longing, vulnerability, intimacy, faithfulness uh, here on earth. And we can say, wow, like that, God created me to have that with him too, to have intimacy and vulnerability with him. He says that he's a faithful husband who doesn't betray, who doesn't leave us or forsake us. And so my experience of sexuality on earth is meant to increase a hunger for me to have intimacy with God. And so now, if we take the aspect of sin, or we take the aspect of even having our sexuality feel very broken, that means something that is powerfully created to help me connect with God now is being used to powerfully distance me from God. And so it's not just that the sin is different, it's that our sexuality is inherently spiritual. And when something goes wrong with it, it is a big barrier to us understanding the love of God.
I think a follow-up question to that, and I've heard people talk about this, is why would God create something that would have so much potential for destruction? Because I think any of us who lives now, we see all around us, we see that it's absolutely like taking our kids out, it's
Mm-hmm.
taking marriages out, it's taking
Yeah,
culture out.
yeah,
It really feels overwhelming. Like if we really take a hard, honest look at the
yes,
way sexuality is being manifest in actual people, in our culture and in our families, we can really become discouraged and very fearful because it can be so destructive. So how do you answer that? Why would God create something with such a potential for
yeah,
the negative to come?
yeah. It's a great question, and I've wrestled with that. I'm the mom of three sons, as I mentioned, and so we walk through these kinds of things in our own family. And I've told people, I don't think there's anything on earth that has caused me more personal pain than sexuality within my marriage, within my own walk, and just what I've witnessed in knowing people who have experienced tremendous sexual pain. And so I've asked that question myself. But I think in order for us to answer that, we've got to understand that sexuality isn't just about sex, it's about love. And sexuality is a physical way that even as, say, teenagers, something awakens in us that prompts us to seek out relationship, that prompts us to share, to be vulnerable. And sexuality is an aspect of love that is powerful. And again, not only is powerful here on earth, but is meant to reflect something powerful in our spiritual longings. And so I would say it's not sexuality as much that's been destructive. It's love that has gone wrong. It's our longing for love. When you talk to people who have been really hurt by sexuality, it's their longing for connection, their longing to be known has been misguided or twisted or betrayed. And so imagine the world without love. Imagine the world without a husband and wife loving each other enough to sacrifice for one another, to procreate together, to start a family. And so when you think about something that's gone so wrong and has the potential for so much destruction, you have to understand that it's that way because it has the potential for so much goodness. And what the Lord has made good, the enemy will try to distort. And the better that gift is, the more aggressively he tries to distort it in our life. And so a lot of addressing this issue in your own life and with other people is recognizing first and foremost what we were created for, the goodness that we were created for, to have relationships where we can share all of who we are and we can love someone enough to want to give our lives for them. That's a beautiful thing that we never want to do away with, even though the destruction of that brings so much pain.
I think that probably resonates with a lot of people in that they want to approach the people they love with love, and they see them hurting and they see them acting out of their hurt in ways that, as somebody who's standing outside of their romantic relationships, maybe sees some destructive behavior. How would you suggest that somebody approach someone that they care about? If we're talking about having hard conversations, I think our listeners want to hear the how. How do I approach this idea from a positive? Because the way you just spun that, I don't want to indicate that it's spin like in a bad way, but you turned the conversation that often has a negative bent and put it into a positive. How do we do that when we are talking about somebody else's pain or somebody else's behavior that is so intimately wired and maybe mixed up with their own desire to be loved?
Yeah, Alex, I'm going to go back to your book, Loving Your Actual Neighbor. I had a chance to interview you on that book on my podcast, Job with Julie. And we had a conversation about what you teach in that book, which is really what I'm passionate about too. It begins with listening, and listening for pain, listening for longing, and not just listening to hear, but listening with empathy, of really connecting with where a person is struggling. And then I think the second step, and you talk about this as well in your book, is to listen with humility. And so I never want to approach somebody with attitude of, you're broken, I've got this figured out, I've got the medicine that you need. We want to approach these conversations with, I see you're in pain. I know that kind of pain. It may look different in my life, but I know the pain of longing for true connection, of wanting to be loved, wanting to be accepted, and being hurt. And I know the things that I've done to run from authentic relationship. And I see you doing some of the same things. And you might not say those exact words, you probably wouldn't, but that's the posture of the heart, is I'm in this with you. And I want to share with you what has brought me life, whether it's sharing my faith with you, sharing how I found healing, sharing how I've learned about healthy steps in relationships. And so we're talking about a long-term conversation. We're not usually talking about just one sit down and hashing things out. You know, I'm trained, as I mentioned, as a psychologist, and even in a clinical setting, we don't hit these things on one session. It takes weeks and months and sometimes years, if there's profound trauma and things to work through, to get to these really sensitive areas in people's lives. And we have to do that same thing in family relationships and friendships.
You know, it sounds so good when you say that, and yet I kind of am looking at, in my mind, like between a husband and a wife, if there's been some breaches, that is a hard thing to not come with anger. It's a
Yes.
hard, and it's also a hard thing to, and that's my question, is where are the boundaries there? You know,
Yeah.
where are the, because if you've been betrayed, that's a really hard thing. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a different situation than looking to minister to someone. When I talked about a few minutes ago about how the physical experience of sexuality is supposed to be a metaphor for the spiritual relationship we have with God, one of the ways that God communicates that is through this idea of covenant. A covenant, which we call marriage, is a lifelong promise to be faithful and to protect each other. And so when somebody cheats on their spouse, they break the covenant promise. And there's a reason to be angry. There's a healthy jealousy that the Bible even tells us that God has. God was angry when his people broke their covenant and their promise, and actually says that God wrote the nation of Israel a certificate of divorce. So God's divorced, in scripture. And that is to show us that there is a time and a place when a promise has been broken within a covenant relationship, where it's not only normal, but it's also healthy to be angry. Now, what we do with that anger is a different story. It doesn't mean that it gives us license to lash out, to hurt somebody back. I've talked to women who have revenge affairs and things like that. That's not what we do with our anger. But you are angry for a good reason. And there needs to be boundaries. There needs to be the time to express that righteous anger. And there needs to be restoration and restitution. You can't just pretend that an affair or betrayal didn't happen. In some cases, you have to even work together to establish a new covenant. Some couples will go through 2 or 3 years of intensive work to work out what's happened between them. And then they say, all right, let's renew our vows. Let's start over again. Because I think, again, it speaks to the power of sexuality, that you can hurt each other in a lot of ways as a husband and wife, but there's something unique about being sexually unfaithful that just cuts to the quick, because it's such a powerful symbol of our promise to each other.
Where does pornography fit into that equation?
Yeah, a lot of people ask that. We know that the great majority of men, I would say, in our day and age, have some struggle with pornography. And probably about 30 to 40% of women have a significant struggle with pornography. And so this is so prevalent that a lot of people are bringing this struggle into marriage, and they're saying to their spouse, hey, this really isn't about you. It's not a rejection of you. And so in some respects, pornography is different in that it's not a flesh to flesh relationship where it's full on adultery. But if there is perpetual use of pornography that somebody's not even attempting to fight against, then when you talk to a spouse who's in that situation, they'll express that they feel that same level of betrayal and hurt and loss of trust that somebody does when there has been adultery. So pornography is not something that should be treated lightly, but I think we also have to recognize it's highly addictive for some people, a lot of people, and they bring that into marriage. And so it's a continual battle for them. And often in the early years of marriage, they try to keep that a secret. And then it gets discovered. And then it's like, oh, I'll never look again. Then it gets discovered again. And now you've got some real undermining of trust in the relationship and in the sexual relationship that needs to really be addressed.
Even as you're talking about that, I think this sense of pain and grief and how deep it cuts, I can feel it.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about how painful that is for people to carry with them if they are the person who's really struggling in that area, and then also if their spouse is. Do you have any words for women who might be listening who are struggling personally, not necessarily their spouse, but they are struggling personally with pornography, and how they start to have those conversations, either if they're single with somebody they trust or if they're married with a spouse?
Yeah, first of all, you're not alone. Like I said, particularly in this younger generation, if you're 35 or younger, the rates of women being exposed to pornography at a young age are just catching up with men, unfortunately. And for some people, for some women, they're introduced into porn through erotica like 50 Shades of Grey, or just online chat rooms or things like that that are more relational and tend to draw you more into, okay, this isn't just about what I'm looking at, it's engaging my emotions. But there are some women who say they're drawn to pornography the same way that men are. It's just the stimulation that comes when we see something highly sexualized that's novel. And so for most of you who are relating to this, you'll be like, yeah, I remember very distinctly the first time I saw porn. I was 11 years old. I was searching for something for school, and this popped up, or a friend introduced me to it, or a boyfriend introduced me to it. And what you need to understand is that the way God has designed our brains to respond to novel sexual experiences is like fireworks going off. And if you think about his original design, that was supposed to happen on our honeymoon, where it's like, wow, like I will never forget that. And all these neurochemicals and adrenaline are rushing through your brain to cement that experience in your mind. And you want to go back to that again and again and again. But pornography hijacks that whole system of reward and pleasure and sexual response. And it becomes addictive because pornography offers something novel, like endless novelty for you to go back to. And so there really is a science behind this. There's also a spiritual battle behind it where you feel like you can't share it with anyone, and so you keep it a secret. And the one thing I would tell you is that you will never heal in hiding. As long as you keep this a secret, it's just going to get worse, and the shame is going to get worse. And the most important thing is to seek out a trusted friend. If you don't have a friend that you can trust, go see a Christian counselor or a counselor that shares your faith background, and just say, hey, I need some help with this. There are a lot of great online support groups. One that I love is called Pure Desire. You can join an online group with other women from really around the world that have a similar struggle, and it's a pretty intense year-long program that just helps you understand pornography and helps you take steps in overcoming it. So there's lots of resources available, but my biggest encouragement is don't hide it anymore. Reach out and get some help, because you're really not alone.
I'd love to speak to this idea about just healthy sexuality, and you have a term for it, and I'm trying to remember what the term is. Sacred sexuality. That's what you call it. Because I really do want to camp in this idea of, what is it meant to look like?
Mm-hmm.
What is it like? Can you give us some handholds on what is sacred sexuality really meant to look like?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, they want to know what's normal. So, they'll ask questions like, if they're married, how often should we be having sex? And should it be like amazing all the time? Or is it okay to have quickies? And there's, good answers to those kinds of questions. But I think more importantly is the question that you're getting at is, what is my sexuality supposed to look like? And the best way I can describe it is picture it like a 3-strand rope all braided together. And the 3 strands are the physical aspect of my sexual drives and desire, my relational drives and desire, that I want to be intimate. I want to be vulnerable. I want to share my life with someone. And then the 3rd strand is the spiritual piece of it, that sexuality is ultimately meant to help me to know God's love and to understand that He created me for intimacy. And so for all of us, those 3 strands of the rope have been frayed and separated in different ways, to where we experience something sexual, even in marriage, where it's totally separate from feeling close to our husband. Or pornography is just a physical expression with no relationship, and we almost feel like God needs to leave the room in the moment. And healing is when we start to reintegrate those 3 strands together, so that we don't ever separate our sexuality from relationship, and also our understanding of God's love, His mercy, His forgiveness, and His redemption. And I think we're all on that journey at some level. No one is completely reintegrated, because a lot of the work that's done to damage sexuality is to separate those pieces out. You think of like the hookup culture. The whole trend is, I can give you my body, but we're not even going to be friends afterwards. It's just about the physical. And what we even see from science is that long term, that damages you emotionally. That sex is never just physical. That, as you alluded to earlier, the Bible talks about how when we sin sexually, we sin against our own bodies, because our bodies were designed to have it integrated with relationship and with our understanding of who we are spiritually.
So I have a follow-up question to that.
Mm.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And yet I see that I also, because of what you're saying, I can see how any kind of sexual abuse or any kind of perversion of that would really make it hard to reintegrate those 3 strands.
Yeah.
So can you speak a little bit to how either you personally can start to reintegrate those 3 strands, or if you're walking with someone who's had that happen, how you help with that?
Yeah. First of all, recognizing that it's a journey. It's not either or. And like I said, we're all on that journey. And when you recognize that it's a journey, you give yourself a lot of grace. So, for example, a lot of women will ask me, what about masturbation? Is masturbation wrong? Does God say it's a sin? And I like to help women understand that masturbation really is less about sexual morality than it is about sexual maturity. That it's not so much, oh, it's bad that you touch yourself or that this feels good, but that masturbation is learning to have a sexual response apart from relationship. And as you grow and as you learn, as you understand more about what sexuality was designed to be, you let go of things like that, because you realize that's really not what I'm after. That's a very momentary feeling of release or pleasure. Really what I'm after is I'm lonely, and I was made for relationship. And so like that's one example. It's one piece of connecting this. I talked to one woman who is really struggling with some forms of sexual addiction, and she had recently given her life to God and was really trying to learn, as somebody who wants to follow God, what do I do with all these relationships that I've had with men? And she told me, she's like, I just keep going back there. Like I walk into work and I see this guy, and the first thing I do is start to think about him sexually. And it's like in that moment, he's all I want. And I asked her, really think about it. Is it really him that you want? How would you feel if you went to bed with him, if you slept with him? How would you feel the next morning? Well, when I do that, I just feel used. I feel horrible. So is he really what you want? And she's like, no, like actually, I want a relationship. Like I want somebody to love me. And I've been sleeping with guys just so I could feel that for half an hour. But really what I want is somebody to love me forever. And so you see that's an example of the taking steps towards the reintegration of sex is never just about sex. A married couple that has been having sex for 20 years, but they honestly say we've never experienced sexual intimacy. It's always about what we do with our bodies. We never share the journey. And it's like, okay, how do we start integrating? I want to know you body, mind, and soul, not just we're giving each other our bodies and we're having our own little secret fantasies. Let's learn to reintegrate the relationship with what we're really pursuing. So those are some examples of how I might encourage a couple or an individual to say, let's take a few steps towards that integration.
And all of that speaks to what you said about sexuality is meant to be a reflection of our relationship with God. Because
Right.
take that woman who's walking into the office and she's evaluating, okay, what am I really desiring? She's saying, I'm desiring a relationship with someone who's going to love me. But the deep wiring of who we are as women is that we are designed to have somebody desire us because God desires a relationship with us. And so that it's deeper than just wanting a relationship with a man. It's
That's
wanting a
exactly right.
relationship with God who created us to have that drive in us that will drive us to him.
Yeah.
Now, it's not
It,
bad to want a relationship with a man, right?
no, it's good. It's
It's
good.
good.
But let me just go off of what you just said there, Alex, because I think it's really key. Some people might know a story of a woman that Jesus interacted with. It's found in the book of John, and people call her the woman at the well. And she was just like that woman that I just described. She was going from man to man to man. And Jesus knew this about her, that she had had 5 husbands and was living with a guy she wasn't married to. When he went to offer her healing, he didn't say, let me bring you the perfect husband. Like, I'm going to be matchmaker.com here and bring you a good guy so you can finally be satisfied. No, he said, I want to give you a well that will never run dry. And he was speaking of himself as the Messiah. And other places in scripture, God actually says, I am your husband. Yeah, I am your lover. I'm your beloved. And so the best of marriages, the best of romantic relationships, even those are going to be unsatisfactory at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
But it's meant to be a reflection or an echo of something greater that we were created for. And so if we just stop at marriage, if we just stop at the ideal romance, we miss the whole thing that it's supposed to be pointing to, which is really that we're created for eternal intimacy with God.
So good. All of this is so good, Julie. I have a question about, I can imagine someone listening and they're thinking, oh my gosh, like I am really off on how I'm integrating my sexuality, or my husband and I are. Maybe there's a couple who they haven't been intimate for a long time, and the person listening is realizing I need to figure this out. How would you recommend someone go about moving forward from there and having those conversations with their spouse?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, let me just tell you, I've been there. 10 years ago when I started this ministry, even though I had all the professional degrees, I was in Christian ministry, I did not understand this. And I was really stuck in the attitude of sex is about pleasing my husband, even though honestly I hate it and I dread it. That's the place I was in, honestly. And so I've been on a journey as I've learned and read and researched and now taught others. There's a whole lot more to this that I never heard, that I never understood. And so I would just invite you on that same journey. It's not a one day aha moment, but it's wow, maybe there's more to this gift than anybody ever told me about. And our whole ministry is around, I know this is a weird term, but I think of we sexually disciple women. And you think about sex education, that's the term we always use. Education is here, you're going to take a class and you're going to know everything you need to know. Discipleship is a lifelong journey of I'm developing, I'm maturing, I'm walking towards a goal. And that's what we do in our ministry is help women understand this bigger picture of sex and just all the time, just keep taking one more step towards God. Where do you need to heal next? Where is your truth going to expose lies? What's a practical thing that I can do with my husband that can help move us towards what God designed this gift to be? And so AuthenticIntimacy.com is our website, and there's just tons of resources there for women who have those same kinds of questions to journey together.
That is really so aligned with what we talk about in the sisterhood all the time. We say this phrase, just take the next step. Like whatever that next step is. And what's so great about what you're saying is that you don't have to be right now responsible for the whole journey. You just need to take the next step. And then once you land there, then God will take you to the next one, because I feel like this topic can feel so overwhelming to people, but really breaking it down that way to say, nope, just today, maybe just today, your first step is to say, yes, I want to do something differently. Maybe that's it today.
That's exactly right. That's very true. One of the things that I've realized on this journey is that everybody has sexual brokenness. You know, it doesn't matter if you grew up in the church, you're virgin on your wedding night. We all have sexual brokenness. There are ways that all of us carry lies and wounds and fears around sexuality. And so we're all on the journey. It's not a goal of, I've got it figured out, now you need to figure it out. It's, let's just journey together. And what I want people to know is God cares about this area of your life. He understands your pain, and he's the redeemer, he's the healer. And so he invites us on this journey not to judge or condemn us, but because he really wants to set us free.
Can you talk a little bit about your book, Rethinking Sexuality, and what people will find there?
Yeah, Rethinking Sexuality, if you are intrigued by this conversation, will take you a lot deeper just in looking at ways that the traditional church has not addressed sexual issues well, and just really what the Bible actually says about God's heart for your sexuality. I think a lot of us that grew up either Catholic or Christian or some formal religion, we learned that maybe God hates sex, or that it's shameful, or that God's still judging me for sins that I've committed in the past, or for even things that have been done to me. And so rethinking sexuality is going to give you a whole new perspective from the Bible of God's heart for this area of our life, why it's so important, why it's under attack, and how we can begin aligning our lives with his truth.
Are there any other resources that you have that you think would be especially helpful as people are navigating this topic?
Yeah, I think from our ministry, if you're married, I'd recommend the book Passion Pursuit. It's just for wives. It's a 10-week Bible study that even comes with videos. You can do it online with our ministry if you want. But that book, really, even writing it, teaching it, is what transformed my view of my marriage. And we've seen God use that book just to really help women get set free. And I think our podcast is a great introduction to a lot of other ministries that are doing work in this space, whether it's sexual abuse recovery, really trying to talk through LGBTQ issues. How do you teach your kids about sex? So the podcast, I get to interview other experts and just hear testimonies of other people that you can connect with and follow up with.
So great. Thank you, Julie. Well, this has been a very, very helpful conversation. Do you have any last words about just this topic to our listeners about hard conversations around sexuality?
Yeah, I would just say, I love what you all do with your podcasting, with your ministry, because you've got to think about this, that we're all in this together. And I think probably more than any other topic, sexuality makes us feel like we're all alone and we're siloed. And so I would just say, don't be afraid to pursue this in community, because you'd be shocked at what other people you know, like they look great on the outside. You'd be shocked to know the kind of pains and questions that they're dealing with. So just be part of building that kind of authentic community that is really searching for truth.
That's great. And it's hard to be the one to go first.
Yeah.
So we're hoping that by us bringing you to our listeners, that's our way of going first. And you're welcome to message us privately too if you need a place to message someone. But nothing beats people who know you in real life and you can be with face to face and can give you a COVID friendly hug. And so we do encourage that and echo that, because that's what we're about at the Sisterhood, is facing things together.
Thank you, Julie, for coming on today. What a gift to the listeners. And we just applaud all that you're doing in your ministry. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a joy to share it with you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.